Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Raymond Hain, and I'm a member of the philosophy department here at PC and the director of the Providence College Humanities Forum. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon's forum, and in particular to welcome our guests from off campus who are participating in the second annual Providence College Aristotelianism Conference. The Providence College Humanities Forum is now in its third year. It's an initiative of the Humanities program, and its purpose is to provide a regular space outside of the classroom for the entire PC community to come together, to reflect on the deepest questions at the heart of our lives as human beings, and to connect us in these reflections to the broader academic community. It's particularly exciting, therefore, that the forum is a part of this joint conference as the host of today's keynote address. This kind of collaboration about the humanities is precisely the aim of the forum and the model of what we hope to continue in the future. Please join me now in welcoming to the podium Professor Colin King, my friend and colleague here in the philosophy department and a co-organizer of today's conference, who will introduce this afternoon's distinguished guest.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Also colleagues from the English department, the Department of Art History, former colleague from philosophy department. Students, I'm really glad to see you here. I have to thank Raymond Hain as one of the very first people to thank for sponsoring all kinds of things. So this is one of many things that profits from his initiative of the Humanities Forum. And so I'm really glad that we could place this in that context. I also have to thank the Dominican friars very much for being not just great people to work with, but very efficient and organized and competent people to work with. I want to thank in particular Father Philip Neary, who's basically been doing all this organization while being a graduate student at Notre Dame in his first year, which is that's the very definition of supererogatory. So thank you very much. Supererogatory means going beyond what is asked. By the way. So I want to thank the Dominicans most sincerely. It's kind of obvious for Dominicans to be interested in Aristotelianism because one of their great doctors of the church, Thomas Aquinas, was an Aristotelian, and so it's obvious for them to support this kind of thing, but it's not always done. So nevertheless, we want to be very thankful. So now I just want to introduce Christof Rapp. Christof is from Germany. He's professor of philosophy at the Ludwig-Maximiliansuniversität in Munich. He's also one of the directors of the Munich School of Ancient Philosophy. Christof is interesting because, well, lots of reasons, but here are a couple. He combines contemporary philosophy with ancient philosophy. He's equally competent in contemporary metaphysics and theory of argumentation as in ancient philosophy. And some of the many wonderful things that you can learn from him is how to translate ancient philosophy into an understandable idiom without being very anachronistic. And another great thing you can learn from him is how to actually be funny while talking about ancient philosophy. So that's why I thought this was a fitting venue for him. Thank you very much, Christof, for coming all this way. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Would like to thank Raymond. I want to thank Colin King, the Dominicans, and all of you for coming, especially those who were volunteered to be the audience this afternoon. As you already heard, this presentation is affiliated to two events, to the Humanities Forum on the one side, but also to a conference on Aristotle's Dialectic and Analytics, his organon. And so I tried to pick a topic that neither bores my expert colleagues nor the rest of you, maybe at the risk of ending up boring all of you. Anyhow, let's see. My talk is about Aristotle's Rhetoric. Aristotle wrote a 3-book work on rhetoric. i.e. the art of speech. And my question is, why rhetoric is, according to Aristotle, based on dialectic. Dialectic is a word with many meanings. I mean, dialectic in the Aristotelian sense, and I will say in a minute what that means. Now, my colleagues, my expert colleagues will say, wait a minute, a paper on the rhetoric at a conference on the organon, isn't that the wrong topic? For isn't the rhetoric just a productive art? There's a long tradition saying that rhetoric is a productive science aiming at the production of speeches. Just like Aristotle's book on poetics, called Poetics, aims at the production of poetry, for example, a tragedy. So doesn't rhetoric just aim at the production of a speech and is thus a productive art? Well, clearly it does not deal with the tools of real philosophy. For the Greek word organon means tool, instrument. And the commentators of Aristotle's used this term to say that there's a group of logical, methodological works which are meant just to provide the tool for philosophical thinking without yet being themselves philosophical science. Still, Arabic, Byzantine commentators usually associated the book of Rhetoric with this organon, with this collection of works dealing with the logical, methodological tools. Why is this so? Probably because in the work Rhetoric, the word syllogismos, mostly translated as syllogism, occurs quite often, and the syllogism is a central topic of his organon. So there's another slide showing the same problem. Here are the Aristotelian works of the organon, the categories, de interpretatione, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and sophistical refutations. And this work is of special importance because it introduces what Aristotle calls dialectic. As I said, I will get to this term in a minute. On the other side, one might think, here are the productive sciences, poetics or rhetoric. And so my aim this afternoon is to show that rhetoric has to be affiliated with the organon, the topics, rather than with the productive sciences, because in this work, Rhetoric, you won't find only a few hints about how to produce a speech. So I will come up with more arguments against that classification. Okay, my claim today is, for Aristotle, rhetoric is essentially based on dialectic. Dialectic is essentially an art of argumentation in Aristotle, and is thus, at least, akin to the organon. And this view presupposes a peculiar approach to what persuasion consists in. And I think this is so an idea that is worthwhile to be considered on its own, independent from all questions of Aristotle scholarship. The first sentence of Aristotle's Rhetoric says, rhetoric is a counterpart to dialectic. So what does this mean? Actually, the Greek word for counterpart is antistrophos. And as you know, as you hear, the prefix anti seems to suggest that it is something that is opposed to something else. So rhetoric is the antistrophos to dialectic. What does this mean? In Greek, it says, rhetorice esti antistrophos te dialectice. Art of rhetoric is a counterpart to dialectic. Indeed, this has puzzled commentators for a long time. So Cicero, for example, said, translated, ex altera parte respondit. So answers, rhetoric answers to dialectic from the other side. It's quite unclear. Alexander of Aphrodisias found it useful to translate antistrophos as isostrophos, saying it's not anti, it's not against, but it's like, it's similar to. And Wilhelm of Moerbeke translated assekutiva ist for antistrophos, meaning follows it. So rhetoric follows it. So what Wilhelm is concerned about is that rhetoric can't be on a par with dialectic because it has to do with practical issues and not with theoretical philosophy. So this is the reason why in the Renaissance, commentators had a big debate about whether antistrophos indicates that rhetoric and dialectic are similar or opposed to each other. Now, the solution is actually quite easy. In a way, Aristotle just used a term that was quite common in his time to accommodate the art of rhetoric. For Isocrates, which was an opponent to the Platonic school, he was the first to say that rhetoric is a counterpart, namely a counterpart to gymnastics. What he wanted to say is that that rhetoric plays the same role with respect to young people's soul as gymnastics does with respect to their body. And this is why Plato, in his dialogue Gorgias, made fun of Isocrates by defining rhetoric as counterpart to cookery in the soul. If you come across this passage, it's very funny. What he wants to say is that just like cookery, with respect to the body, does not bring about health, but just a pleasant feeling because the cook tries to flatter his customers by preparing sweet or spicy dishes. So rhetoric with respect to the soul does not bring about the good state of the soul, but just something that pleases or flatters the audience. So what follows from this history is that Aristotle uses this term to refer to an analogy. Rhetoric is for one realm of discourse what dialectic is for a different realm of discourse or reality. And this gets clear on this slide. So why is rhetoric supposed to be a counterpart to dialectic? Quote, for both rhetoric and dialectic are concerned with things that are such that they are to be known as common to all and as not belonging to any separate branch of science. A result is that all people in some way share in both, for all up to a point try to test and uphold a thesis and to defend themselves and to attack others. So look, just as everybody tries to test and uphold theses, and this is what dialectic does in a methodological way, in a similar way, everybody tries to defend him or herself or tries to attack others, and this is what rhetoric is concerned with. So this formula of the antistrophos just means an analogy relation between rhetoric and dialectic. What dialectic is in one field, rhetoric is in the other field. This sentence, by the way, is also, now I'm looking to my expert colleagues, a reason for why the picture of rhetoric as a productive science is inappropriate, because a productive science would be related to a particular field of reality. So shoemaking is a productive art because it aims at the production of shoes. But it has a limited part of reality as its subject matter, i.e. shoes. Medicine is a productive art because it aims at bringing about health. But rhetoric and dialectic are not related to a separate discipline or realm, but they can be generally, universally applied. So that's a slide that is meant just to repeat what I just said. And we can go to the implication. That rhetoric is a counterpart to dialectic does not mean that all kinds of rhetoric have always been based on dialectic. It rather means that rhetoric, properly understood, properly conceived, should be construed as a counterpart to or a branch of dialectic. Yeah? You see, Aristotle wants to say rhetoric so far was not in a very efficient or proper state. But if we understand rhetoric rightly conceived, rhetoric should be construed as a kind of dialectic. And this implies that rhetoric, so the current state of which Aristotle finds unsatisfactory, so the rhetoric of his competitors or predecessors is quite unsatisfactory, that rhetoric should undergo a reform by becoming a branch of dialectic. Yeah? So that's the idea. So people, rhetoricians, use tricks of all kinds. So they bring their wife and kids to the speaker's platform in order to raise pity for their case, or they shout at people, they try to distract people, they try to arouse the emotions of the audience. But that's not the kind of rhetoric that Aristotle would favor. But here's the idea that rhetoric, properly conceived, should undergo a reform by turning it into a branch of dialectic. And the same idea is expressed in Aristotle in other formulas too. It follows that rhetoric is like an offshoot of dialectic, that it is similar to it, and this is just what we said in the beginning. So here's several terms for expressing the same idea. Cross-references. Here, I use here cross-references as an indication for saying, actually, Aristotle's work on rhetoric is related to his work on dialectic, the topics, in many ways. And one way of this relatedness and embeddedness are cross-references. The rhetoric has many cross-references to the project of the dialectic, to the book topics, and to entois syllogismois, which I take to refer also to the topics, or to the sophistical refutations. Also, that's also an interesting phenomenon. Aristotle introduces into the art of rhetoric a number of terms, technical terms, that are familiar from dialectic. For example, the terms syllogismos, deduction, protasis, premise, endoxon, reputable opinion, elenchos, refutation, enstasis, objection, epagoge, induction, topos, topos. There are many overlaps. That's also a really strong significance for the kinship of both projects. So you find duplication of lines in both works. So here's just a short list of lines that occur in both works. And here's an interesting passage. In this passage, Aristotle announces in his book on dialectic in the topics that dialectic is useful for the encounter with the many, so with addressing a mass audience. And in the rhetoric then, he says, as we said in the topics, it's useful for addressing a mass audience. And here is the quotation for purposes. So dialectic, or the content of the treatise topics, is useful for the purpose of encounters. It is useful because when we have counted up the opinions held by the many, we shall meet them on the ground not of other people's convictions, but of their own. So this is the idea that if you want to persuade a public audience, you have to observe what their convictions consist in, and to start with their convictions in order to persuade them. And the same is echoed in the rhetoric, where he says, it's necessary for means of persuasions and arguments to be formed on the basis of common beliefs, i.e. the beliefs of the many, as we said in the topics about the encounter with the many. Encounter with the many is an awkward formulation, but it refers to the situations that philosophers leaving their colleges and encounter a public audience or the democratic mass. So, in a way, the idea that rhetoric should be turned into dialectic was also already promoted by Plato. So isn't that what old Plato already said? It might be that some of you already came across the dialogue Gorgias by Plato or the dialogue Phaedrus. And in both works, Plato addresses rhetoric. And indeed, Plato thought that contemporary rhetoric is in a quite deplorable state, just as Aristotle. Plato tends to identify rhetoric with sophistry. And in his Gorgias, he famously denies that rhetoric can be an art, techne, at all. That's in a way also funny in Plato's context, because the Greek word rhetorike, from which our word rhetoric comes from, is an adjective which needs the supplement art. So it's the rhetorical what? The rhetorical art. So in this dialogue, Gorgias asks Socrates, what kind of art do you think rhetoric is? And Socrates replies, no art at all. Why isn't it an art? Each art, Socrates or Plato assumes, has a determinate subject. But logos, speech, can't be the subject matter of rhetoric, since it is just a medium. Since you can speak about everything, it's not really a subject matter, a determinate subject matter, but itself a medium. And Plato also thinks that the use of rhetoric is opposed to the attempt to convey the truth and must hence be motivated by deplorable motives. So the idea is this: why should we use rhetoric? Either you know the truth or you don't know it. If you know the truth, why don't you just teach it? And then you don't need rhetoric. Just say what the truth is. So if you apply rhetoric, he concludes, you must have somehow egoistic, deplorable motives. And now, interestingly, in his dialogue Phaedrus, Plato, he remains suspicious about the traditional rhetoric, but he also envisages the idea of a reformed rhetoric, and this is, he says, based on what he calls dialectic. Dialectic in Plato is a word that he always uses for the method of philosophers. But I mean, Plato was active as a philosophical author for 50 years, and through these 50 years, he several times changed his attitude to what exactly dialectic consists in. But what remained the same is always the idea that dialectic is the method of philosophers. Now here in the Phaedrus, Plato thought that the art of division, the hieresis and collection, diagoge, is dialectic. So for example, he has the funny example that someone who wants to prepare a speech on donkeys and horses, he should be able to make a division between donkeys and horses, because otherwise he would confuse in his speech both species. So this new rhetoric in Plato is meant to convey the truth, or at any rate, true opinions. It's also based on the art of leading the soul, psychagogia, which again requires dialectic for the true subdivision of the soul. So in Plato, the idea of reforming rhetoric by dialectic is identical with the idea of turning rhetoric into a philosophical endeavor, which is just meant to teach and to convey the truth, which is always truth-based. And now, this is another slide that shows the same point. I want to compare this with Aristotle's notion of dialectic. And if you felt drowsy in the meantime, you should wake up now again, because that's the main point. Aristotle has a very peculiar idea of what dialectic consists in. And here it comes. In the first line of his book Topics, he says that the project of dialectic consists in, or the goal of this study is to find a method with which we shall be able to construct deductions from acceptable, reputable premises concerning any problem that is proposed, and when submitting to arguments ourselves, will not say anything inconsistent. So this is a very, very ambitious project. The project consists in not less than saying it's a method for providing arguments for and against any given thesis from not established premises, but acceptable premises. So that is meant, the method of dialectic is meant to be a machine for producing arguments. And actually, it's very useful to have such a machine in everyday life, because whatever thesis is proposed, by this machine, you will be able to analyze this thesis and to produce arguments for and against it. And now, as you can see, this method, as opposed to Plato, has not the purpose of conveying or teaching scientific knowledge. For Aristotle, dialectical argumentation is defined by arguing on the basis of premises that are accepted but not established as true on endoxa, accepted, acceptable, reputable opinions. The dialectical inquiry only aims at the assessment of consistency or inconsistency of propositions. And the dialectical competition, as pictured in the topics, proceeds as a Q&A game between exactly two disputants, the questioner Q and the answerer A. And this is actually what is going on in Aristotle's topics. He describes a question and answer game with two competitors. One of the competitors has the role of the answerer, A, and one of the questioner. Now, what exactly is going on here? In the beginning of each round of this game, the answerer has to commit himself to one side of a contradictory pair of assertions, P or non-P. So he or she has to commit himself or herself just to saying, I'm going to defend P, or I'm going to defend non-P, either way. A, the answerer, is not at all expected to choose between P and non-P in accordance with his own convictions. But once he has decided between P and non-P, the statement chosen goes into A's commitment store. So I think of a commitment store like a backpack. So you say, I commit myself to the claim P, so this goes into my commitment store. Yeah? Now, the questioner is supposed to bring A to further commitments. How does he do that? Well, he asks questions, and A has to answer by yes or no. And by answering to a question with yes or no, he commits himself to either P or non-P. And immediately this goes into his commitment store. Whatever A, the answerer, confirms goes into his commitment store. Also, when Q can derive a conclusion from what A has already admitted, this conclusion goes immediately into his commitment store. And now, the purpose is clearly that the answerer doesn't want to have inconsistent commitments in his backpack. So he doesn't want to have contradictions in his commitment store. And as soon as a contradiction to A's original commitment, P or non-P, appears in his commitment store, the game is over. A has lost and Q has won. Vice versa, if after predetermined time or after predetermined number of questions by Q, A's commitment store is still consistent, i.e. includes no contradictory statements, Q has lost and A has won. For making A assent to the suggested premises, it is essential that Q knows which premises or statements are endoxon, acceptable, accepted or reputable opinions, and which are not. Also, for deriving necessary conclusions from what A has already assented to, Q has to be an expert in deductive arguments. He must know how to deduce conclusions from given premises. So the respective expertise in syllogismoi, deductions, syllogisms, includes the ability to discern valid and invalid arguments, or to overlook in general the manifold ways in which such syllogismoi can be construed. And in the topics, Aristotle gives a long catalogue of so-called topoi, which seem to represent different ways of construing such deductive arguments. So if we regard the topoi as something like argumentative schemes, the acquaintance with these schemes will help us to identify or to construe valid arguments, just as the acquaintance with a list of possible fallacies, as given in Sophisticae Elenchi, will help us to detect or to avoid deceptive arguments. So Aristotle's book Topics consists of several hundreds of so-called topoi, argumentative schemes, by which the dialectician can analyze any given thesis for means of refuting or defending this thesis. So, before we proceed, we have now seen that the notion of dialectical argumentation unfolded in Aristotle in the Topics is quite different from the one presupposed in the Phaedrus in Plato. Hence, Aristotle's reasons for turning rhetoric into a branch of dialectic must be different from Plato's. It's not the purpose of teaching, conveying the truth. Still, we should keep in mind that the dialectical question and answer game we have just encountered is quite different from the situation of a speaker facing a public audience in many respects. So, for example, for the most part, the public speaker speaks in monologues, just as I do now. I do not ask you for your assent in each and every instance. He does not raise questions, the speaker in a public audience, and the audience is not supposed to assent to each and every statement. Also, the speaker does not aim at refuting the audience, as the dialectician does, but at convincing them. Now, how is it then that dialectic is useful, is meant to be useful for rhetoric or for the new rhetoric? What does this somehow artificial question and answer game contribute to the reformation of rhetoric in general? And so, in short, my answer is this. In order to make use of dialectic and to use dialectic for the art of rhetoric, one has to choose a new and very peculiar approach to the phenomenon of persuasion, of persuading, convincing people. And here's the core idea, which is just one sentence long, so you can easily memorize it. Totega pistoiomen malista hotan apodedaichtai hypolabomen. In English, we are most easily convinced, persuaded, when we think that something has been proven. We are most easily convinced whenever we think that something has been proven. So here's the core idea in its context. This entire sentence, persuading, making people believe, Aristotle says is a kind of proof. For, here it comes, we are most convinced when we think that something has been proven. The rhetorical proof is the enthymeme. And this is, in a word, the most important of the ways of making people believe. It's most important. But the enthymeme is a kind of syllogism, while it is the task of dialectic to deal equally with each sort of syllogism, either of the whole of dialectic or of a certain part of it. So this is the idea. Convincing people, persuading people is reduced to its essence, just a kind of proving a point. And we, rational human beings, are by nature disposed in a way such that if we think that something has been proven, we are convinced of that item that has been proven. And here is the core idea one more time. Totega pistoiomen malista hotan apodedaichtai hypolabomen. We are most convinced when we think that something has been proven. It's actually my favorite sentence in Aristotle's Rhetoric. I recently learned that among my younger colleagues, there is the new fashion of having one's favorite Greek terms tattooed somewhere on the body. So I met a colleague last year who did her PhD on philia, friendship, and hence tattooed the Greek word philia in her neck. So I was wondering for a long time whether I could do that with my favorite sentence too, but it's a very long sentence. And so for the meantime, I have to make do with this sticker that I printed. So here it is. We are most convinced when we think that something has been proven. By the way, it turned out that it's much cheaper to produce 1,000 of them than a few. So please help yourself. I'm aware that it doesn't fit any color. Okay. Okay, I think that's what meant by a take-home result. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay, where does this lead us to? Let's quickly elaborate on this core idea. We want to convince a given audience of why. Okay? How to do that? For this purpose, we have to take up a proposition X already approved by or accepted by the audience, from which the target proposition Y deductively follows, or at least seem to follow. Yeah? You want to convince a given audience of Y, so take up another proposition P from which Y follows or seems to follow. Given certain subsidiary conditions, whoever is convinced of proposition X will also be convinced of proposition Y once he or she learns that there is an inferential connection between the two propositions, right? In a way, the core idea is not at all surprising. As human beings, Aristotle thinks we desire to understand the things we encounter. We want to hear reasons, proofs, warrants for what we are supposed to believe. Once we are given proofs that we take to be conclusive, we have a reason for accepting a certain proposition as conviction. This goes in our conviction store, as it were. In other words, the core claim seems to be grounded in, or at least compatible with, some of Aristotle's anthropological convictions. Also, the core idea allows Aristotle to connect the analysis of persuasion with certain concepts he feels familiar with: apodoxis, proof, syllogismos, syllogism, etc. The dialectical competence applied to rhetoric. So I can cut that short. The idea is simply this. The dialectical core competence has two parts which are applied to rhetoric. First, we have to identify views that are accepted by a given audience, i.e. that's the dialectical competence for endoxa, accepted opinions. And number two, drawing conclusions from them. So we need two kinds of competence: competence for picking the right premises and a competence for drawing conclusions, deductive conclusions. And this is what we already read concerning the first competence in these two passages, when we have counted up the opinions held by the many. So the rhetorician, the dialectician, needs the competence to distinguish which proposition is held accepted by which audience. And competence number two is the deductive competence. It is obvious then that he who is most capable of consider where the syllogismos is taken from and how it comes about will also be most enthymematic, i.e. will be the master of the enthymeme, if he only grasps in addition about what kind of things the enthymemes, the rhetorical proofs, are formulated and which differences there are in comparison to the logical syllogism. And these two differences are just two differences. So the picture is this. The dialectician has two kinds of competence that defines dialectic. So identifying accepted opinions and making deductions from them. And now this dialectical competence makes someone a master of rhetoric if we only consider two differences between the dialectical situation and the rhetorical situation. And this is, number one, rhetoric's function is to deal with such things we deliberate about and for which we have no art. And difference number two, among such listeners that are not able to see many things together and to draw conclusions from far away. That means, in other words, the rhetorical proofs have to deal with things that are not necessarily the case, but also only for the most part the case. This is why rhetoricians, as opposed to dialecticians, have to deal with proofs of probability. And second, listeners are not able to see many things together. That means a mass audience does not only consist of smart philosophers who are able to follow long arguments. And this is why rhetorical arguments, as opposed to dialectical ones, have to be short and shorter than dialectical ones. So this is the general picture, and it has some interesting philosophical consequences by which I want to conclude this presentation. First consequence. Obviously, what Aristotle presents here, as opposed to Plato's picture, has nothing to do with teaching. It's not an idea that the rhetorician is a teacher who teaches, conveys the truth. And I mean, this is important because in public political speeches, the rhetorician has often to do with issues that do not allow of proper knowledge and that hence cannot be taught. So here are quotations to prove that point. Consequence number two. Just as dialectic, rhetoric is able to deal with opposites. So sciences, in a way, have to proceed from one principle that is established as true. But dialectic and rhetoric can draw conclusions about opposites. Dialectic and rhetoric alone do this, since both are equally concerned with opposites. So if you have the dialectical art or if you have the rhetorical art, you can argue for both sides of a story, for and against every thesis. And this is also why, for Aristotle, rhetoric is a neutral tool. This is why I put neutrality on the board. So Aristotle here says, this is interesting, furthermore, one must be able to persuade of the opposites, just as in the case of deductive arguments. Not that we may actually do it, for one should not persuade what is deplorable, but in order that it may not escape our notice how things are, and that we ourselves may be able to refute if another person uses the arguments unjustly. So, of course, Aristotle does not want to raise young rhetoricians who persuade an audience of what is unjust and what is just false and in other ways deplorable. But the art of rhetoric in itself is applicable in both ways. This is interesting as opposed to the later tradition of rhetoric, where, for example, Cicero defended the idea of a vir bonus, so the virtuous man who is the true rhetorician. Only a virtuous person, Cicero thinks, can be really persuasive. This is not true of Aristotle's art of persuasion because you can use it either way. Further point, the status of rhetoric. Very closely, if dialectic is meant to be an art or method, rhetoric must also be an art or techne or method, and this is why Aristotle dispenses with Plato's notorious criticism that rhetoric cannot be an art. Centrality of proofs. Aristotle says they, the other rhetoricians, his predecessors, say nothing about the enthymeme, the rhetorical proof, which is the body of persuasion. So the body of persuasion is, of course, a metaphor. But, I mean, it's easy to decipher this metaphor because it seems to mean the enthymeme, rhetorical proofs, are central to persuasion. And if proofs are central, this yields a very specific sort of rhetoric, namely a rhetoric that is based on the principles of reasonableness. Whenever proofs are given a central role in the process of persuasion, we get a persuasive strategy that is in principle concerned about reasonableness and not only about effectiveness. A speaker who focuses on proofs commits himself in principle to the idea that he has to make his point of view acceptable for an addressee, who is, in principle again, rational and critical, in the sense that she or he can assess the plausibility of views and would be prepared to reject a proposed view in the absence of proofs or due to the lack of good reasons, and that he or she is able to detect distracting or non-pertinent maneuvers. So the idea is that a rhetoric that is based on reasonableness is quite different from addressing the drowsy audience of an average TV morning show. But it presupposes an audience that is able of criticize the arguments put forward and say that a certain claim is not actually justified by the arguments given. Or, for example, what is often more important, that the speaker does not really speak about the issue, but tries to distract the audience by bringing up non-pertinent maneuvers. So a rhetoric that is based on reasonableness counts on a, in principle, mature and critical audience. And this is important, I think, because sometimes rhetoricians just deal with effectiveness. They don't care how persuasion come about, but they only care about how to persuade an audience at any cost. In the passage immediately preceding the formulation of the core idea and the centrality of proofs, Aristotle criticizes his predecessors because they give most of their attention, he says, to matters external to the subject. For slender, pity, anger, and such emotions of the soul do not relate to facts, but are appeals to the member of the jury. So put in our terms, Aristotle diagnoses here a conflict between reasonableness and effectiveness of persuasion. The predecessors want to be effective, i.e., want to persuade the audience at any cost, thus neglecting the normative standards of reasonableness, while he himself, Aristotle, counteracts this tendency by stressing the centrality of proofs or arguments. Now, here is the part where I wanted to make a brief digression on modern argumentation theory, but since I'm running out of time, just clicking through that passage, annotating that, it's interesting that in contemporary argumentation theory, there are two camps, one of which calls themselves rhetoricians and the other dialecticians. And the dialecticians are mostly trained philosophers or logicians. They promote normative accounts of argumentation by highlighting the standards of reasonableness, whereas the rhetoricians are mostly affiliated to speech departments, and they tend to see argumentation, sorry, this was too quick, argumentation as a form of communication that aims at a certain effect. Accordingly, whether a particular act of argumentation is useful or not must be assessed in terms of the addressee's reaction. So a speech act, a rhetorical speech act from the point of view of effectiveness is successful when the audience is actually persuaded, whereas the dialecticians try to assess reasonableness. So they are interesting names: Stephen Toulmin, Chaim Perelman, Lucy Olbrechts-Tüttekar, and here Elsebart, Eric Krabbe, Franz van Emmeren, Rob Grotendorst. So this is the Dutch camp who tried to renew Aristotelian dialectic in contemporary argumentation theory. And they try to define what they call reasonableness by certain rules that must be obeyed and fallacies that must be avoided. But now I'm coming back to Aristotle and finally to the conclusion of my presentation. Let's think one more minute about the conflict between reasonableness and effectiveness. Yeah? So if you want to become a rhetorician, or if you have to give a public speech, you can perhaps choose between these two extremes, whether you center on the reasonableness of the arguments you put forward, or whether you just aim at the effect of persuading people at any cost. So rhetoric deals with the available sources of persuasiveness in any given case. A rhetorician who uses Aristotle's art of rhetoric wants, as other rhetoricians, to win his or her case, i.e. wants to effectively persuade his audience. That means that he or she cannot neglect effectiveness, which in principle could lead to a conflict with the maxim of argumentative proof-based persuasion. Now, facing this conflict between effectiveness and reasonableness, Aristotle's core idea, this one, i.e. that we are most convinced if we think that something has been proven, exactly, this one, this core idea can solve the conflict between effectiveness and reasonableness by claiming that proofs sensibly adapted to the demands of public speech are themselves most effective, so that we do not need rhetorical tricks and distractions. And I think I drove my point home, so I finish here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christof. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I'm going to bring the microphone to you. Otherwise, the questions will go unrecorded. Bless you. Bruce Graver.
So the simple version of this is, what's book 2 got to do with it? Or more complexly, he spends a great deal of time talking about emotion and defining them and talking about how to use them. Is it simply subordinate to the enthymeme?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I suppressed the fact that Aristotle does not only deal in his rhetoric with proofs, logos, but also with ethos and pathos. What does this mean? Ethos means the character of the speaker. So Aristotle thinks that it's useful that the speaker presents himself as trustworthy or credible, because the audience thinks or forms the second-order judgment that if the person of the speaker is trustworthy or credible, what he's going to say is most certainly true. And also, what our colleague referred to, he deals with pathos, i.e. the emotional state of an audience. And now, I do think that these two means of persuasion, although in contemporary literature they are given most attention due to the attractiveness of positions dealing with emotions and characters in the contemporary theoretical frame, I think that they are meant to be accessories to what is central, i.e. logos, and this is argumentative persuasion. Now, if we frame this in this terms of effectiveness or reasonableness, I would be prepared to say that, in a way, I mean, look, the reasonableness program is a normative program for rhetorical research. And the effectiveness program is a more descriptive empirical research program. Now, one could frame this by saying that Aristotle makes this admission to the empirical approach that, as a matter of fact, the reasonableness of arguments is not the only factor that plays a role in the formation of an audience's judgment, so that the rhetorician should also make sure that she or he comes across as credible and that the audience is in a suitable psychological state. But this is not meant to confuse the difference between what is central, what is the body of persuasion, and what is only supportive or accessory. So thank you very much for this question.
I think this question is a follow-up, actually. So let's presume reasonableness on the side of the rhetoric. Mm-hmm. What sorts of rhetorical tricks am I then allowed to subsequently use and kind of add on to my reasonable account? So stickers probably are allowed, I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, of course.
But
they don't appeal to our emotions, but
they might. I mean, some people really
not
like
my
stickers.
Not my sticker.
That's right. But so are there any rhetorical tricks that I'm not allowed to use if I'm also making a reasonable case?
Okay. Now look, so my approach to what Aristotle says about these things is this. I mean, he wants to get the priorities right. And I mean, he perceives the current situation of rhetoric in the following way. He thinks that rhetoricians mostly deal with points that do not contribute to the issues, that are just not pertinent, that try to distract, to confuse the audience. And his point is, in this passage I quoted, just first things first. Argumentative persuasion is central because this is how we human beings are accustomed to function. We want to hear proofs and are most easily persuaded by them. So if the rhetorician is well advised to develop a theory of rhetoric by highlighting proofs, this does not exclude that he brings in other means of persuasion, as ethos and pathos, being so down-to-earth enough to know that the worse the audience is, the less effective will the proofs be if they meet an audience that is, for example, in a hostile frame of mind, or if they just find the speaker not credible or just don't like him or whatever. And so he doesn't point out then in detail what is allowed or what is not allowed, but the message is, so first things first, centrality of the proofs, and then don't be a fool. Try to win your case.
Thank you. I have a question about what seems to me might be another sentence that you could have put on stickers, which is that the enthymeme is the body of pistis, so the soma tes pisteos.
Yeah.
I have two questions about this. One is more general about your choice of translation. I guess I'm wondering about, the first question then is about pistis. And I'm wondering, is it that the enthymeme is a body of persuasion in the sense of the sort of substance of the act of the speaker in persuading, or the state of the hearer when they have come to be persuaded? Second question, I couldn't help but think of the Poetics throughout your talk, which is very nice. But he says famously in the Poetics that the myth or the plot is the soul of tragedy.
Yes,
Do you
mythos, yeah.
do you think it's significant that he says body here rather than soul?
No, on your second question, I haven't thought that this is significant. I once collected similar metaphors in the oeuvre and also mentioned the soul of the tragedy point, but I don't think that is a purposeful relation between body or soul. A question on pistis is very good, but I can't translate pistis with one word because for sure pistis can mean in general and in Aristotle at least three things, i.e. the activity of persuading people. So what I'm doing to persuade you as a speaker, then the resulting state, the state of being persuaded, and in the rhetoric in a technical sense, it means all efforts, all identifiable particular efforts put forward in order to reach that state. And then there is a technical, traditional, rhetorical sense, which means the part of the speech which is meant to bring up your arguments or proofs. So in forensic rhetoric, for example, you make your claim, you speak briefly about the person of your opponent, and then you bring up your evidence, and then your conclusion. And the part in which you bring up your evidence is called pistis. And since this is from the first chapter of the Rhetoric, where he hasn't introduced his own vocabulary, it's always a discussion between which kind of terminology does he want to adopt. But it's very important that you refer to this ambiguity in the term of pistis. It means these three or four things.
Hello. Yeah, so sort of a follow-up to some of the first questions I brought up. So, yeah, a question about your solution. So it seems like you're saying, so Plato thought a lot of dialectic, so he didn't like rhetoric for that reason. And then I'll give a more insidious interpretation than what you said. So Aristotle thinks the same thing of rhetoric, but he just demotes dialectic, so now they can get along because they're both kind of iffy. So put it in different ways. So you said Aristotle can solve this tension between reasonableness and effectiveness because he says we are most easily convinced or persuaded when we think something's reasonable. That's true, but that just, to me, I hear that and I think, yeah, so all you're saying is, hey, if you want to be like evil and Machiavellian and insidious to a population that prides themselves on being reasonable, then you have to give the appearance of giving a proof. You can't distract them with shiny things. You have to distract them with what they think is more important. So, like, for example, if you want to convince people now, you have to give something that looks like a scientific proof, which means you have to make something, you have to throw some math up on the board, and you have to use the word hypothesis a lot, and you have to like say, we went out and we asked a bunch of people and we ran regression analyses, and people are like, oh, that's okay. Like whatever they said at the end, that's true because I was just shown a proof, right? So isn't that just saying, now if you want to be rhetorically effective, you take on the trappings of dialectic, which itself is not normatively oriented towards truth anymore. It's just a mere neutral tool that can be used for anything.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That points to important questions, of course. So number one, concerning the difference to Plato, yeah, I mean, it's important that there is a level of rational discourse beyond teaching and conveying the truth. And this is in particular important when we have to deal with issues, as Aristotle thinks, in public speech that do not allow of a scientific treatment. So, I mean, if Plato in the Phaedrus is serious about this model, so then he thinks that just what a rhetorician has to do is just to tell the people the truth, so to be able to distinguish between donkeys and horses, and then call the donkey a donkey and the horse a horse. That's all what a rhetorician has to do. And now think of problems that cannot be framed in a scientific way. Should we build a wall or not? I mean, we the Athenians. Is it good to build this wall or not? Well, there's no science telling us the right answer. So there's a way of rational discourse about this question beyond the level of science and conveying knowledge. And this is an important progress, I think, compared to the simplistic way in which I presented the Federer's picture. Then you made the point that, well, yeah, Machiavelli could use that too, and so give arguments for his point of view. And I say, yeah, that's not excluded. So it's not a built-in good maker in this system of rhetoric. That's not what I'm saying. This is why I'm emphasizing the difference to all moralizing attempts to rhetoric as Cicero's vir bonus idea. But I think a progress consists in if your method just or mainly instructs you to provide arguments for given problems, then you have to speak to the audience in terms of arguments. You say, here's a claim, here's something in support of this claim. And provided that it is a mature and critical, rational audience, they can assess whether the arguments put forward actually support a point or not, or whether you try to distract them from the main point or not. And this, I think, is a progress compared to a just emotional, appealing, distractive way of doing rhetoric.
Sir Robert Bolton from Rutgers University.
Thanks, Christof. I think my question is somewhat related to the last one, but I'll state it anyway. Your favorite line, we are most persuaded, or we find most credible, perhaps something when we think it's been proved. And so dialectic turns out to be useful in rhetoric because it, so to speak, makes people think things have been proved. Okay. Now, suppose, however, people see that the basis for dialectic is not premises that are true, as you said,
yes,
but things which are accepted.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
And now suppose you realize the fact that something can be deduced from what's accepted
Sure.
Doesn't prove it.
Sure.
So
Sure.
if prove means show to be true, then when you realize rhetoric doesn't do that, doesn't show anything to be true, won't that undermine the value of rhetoric? Now I see that you say, well, if the audience is critical and so on and so on and so on, but what I'm really thinking about is we still have to follow the rules of dialectic. I guess you can say, well, they'd have to move beyond dialectic, beyond agreeing to things as premises because they're accepted. They'd have to move beyond that to make any use of it, but that's to move away from rhetoric.
Yeah.
So I'm worried about the line which says we find it persuasive when you think it's been proved, where that means shown to be true.
Okay. Thank you, Rob, for listening one more time to my rhetoric presentation, and thank you for raising this question. Well, I think Aristotle's point of departure is that the possible impact of a rhetorician in a limited time facing a mass audience is really quite limited. And what he can do to lead his audience to a proposed suggestion is just to work with their given convictions. So a rhetorician in this short time cannot change your strongly held convictions. So if, say, a rhetorician faces an audience with racist prejudices, he probably won't be able in 10 minutes or so to change this attitude. So in a way, he has to try if he wants to lead them to something which he takes to be a better solution, he has to work with other convictions, extant given convictions. And so the modest thing that a rhetorician can achieve in this time is pick up existing convictions that are suitable for what I want to reach, and then lead the audience by referring to these convictions, which may or may not be rational in themselves, to something else that is inferentially connected with it, which I take to be a better point of view. And this exactly takes what I regard as the two dialectical core competencies: competence for identifying what is accepted in which audience, and deducing from it a conclusion that I want to establish in this audience. Yeah. Oh, the audience saying, oh, that's just saying, okay, I'm not convinced by that, because I know that you're just saying this because you expect me to be convinced of what seems to be proven, right? Yeah, that's possible.
Last question, Christopher Hauser from Rutgers.
Thanks for the talk, Christoph. So I have a clarification, then a question. So clarification on how you're understanding the malista pisteumen. Are you understanding that as you're best persuaded of something when you've been given a proof, or the best way to persuade someone of something is to give a proof?
Well, I gave alternative translations. I suggested alternative translations for malista. Malista means most, and it could mean it's most likely that you are persuaded. You can be most strongly persuaded or most easily persuaded. Since this is actually a formulation in a very early terminological part of this treatise, I do not want to commit me to one of these possibilities.
Well, just
I think actually, if I may add something, I mean, in Aristotle's moral psychology, there's the phenomenon of habituation, and habituation can be pictured as a sort of strong conviction or something like this, and you can differentiate degrees of being convinced or persuaded. And I think this is not at stake here in rhetoric, because you want to have the quick judgment. You want to give your speech, 10 minutes, then you want to have the audience's vote. That's it. That doesn't require the deepness of conviction. And for this reason, I don't think that this is the impact of malista in this context.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think they're two very different claims. I mean, one is a claim about the strength of the audience's conviction, that they're going to have the strongest conviction in something you're trying to persuade if you've given a proof, as opposed to trying to convince them in some other way. And the other is about, what's the quickest way to get them to say yes to something.
Yeah, I tend to the second one. I see the difference.
So if it is the second one, then here's the question. You might think that Aristotle's just wrong about this. And now you said this core claim rests on some anthropological claims, and you cited the desire to understand passage, but that seems more about our desire for explanatory knowledge rather than our desire to believe true things or something like that. Yeah. So the question is this: suppose that you think this is wrong because you watch the recent election or things like that, and you think, no, people are persuaded by other things than just proofs. They're persuaded by the distractions much more easily than they are by the proofs. Then what anthropological claims are falsified by this? So in other words, what's really the anthropological claim that's driving this assumption, or this core claim?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that people decide to understand is in one way or the other pertinent, because, I mean, it's also kind of explanation that you can expect in such rhetorical proofs, not only, but also, so what is it, what grounds the goodness of this or that decision also. You also ask, why is it good to do this or that? And a rhetorical proof can be meant to give such an explanation. So I wouldn't make a sharp division between a desire for explanatory knowledge and other kinds of desiring understanding. My impression is this, but this is just like an intuition, that on the one side there is this anthropological claim, and then Aristotle acknowledges differences in the quality of audiences, and this is why he instructs the rhetorician not to give lengthy arguments and so on and so forth. That means that these distractions, accessories, become the more important, the less the audience is educated, attentive, the less time there is, the more controversial the issue is, and so on and so forth. So I would say my favorite sentence can be related to this sort of anthropological claims, but then Aristotle deals with social reality of a given mass audience, and the worse the situation is, the less impact can be given to proofs. That's true. But again, I mean, first things first. I mean, think of what should be central to your techne. Do you want to base your techne on distractions, how you can flatter the jury, and so on and so forth, how you can raise fear in the audience? Or do you want to center your rhetorical techne on this fine-grained method of dialectical invention of arguments, and then build the other things around that? I think that makes a difference.
Can I ask a question? Follow up?
I mean, but I'm just wondering, because the way you wanted to resolve the tension seems to crucially rely on this claim. So if it turns out that there are other ways of speaking that are more effective, then this claim is falsified if we're understanding Melista as the best, that is most easy way to convince someone is to prove it, because there are all sorts of cases where that's not true.
Ceteris paribus, people are most convinced if they think, but maybe there are bad conditions in which other factors become more important.
The old ceteris paribus trick. So before we thank Christof very warmly, I wanted to remind you that we actually have a reception, which is directly across from this room. And thank you very much, Christof, for this presentation.
Thank you for your patience.